Okay, brilliant. So good morning, everyone, and welcome to this morning session. And I want to first start with saying thank you to Professor Kingma for inviting me to participate. I'm hugely excited and also really sad that I'm not with you in person. As I was, sort of saying yesterday, is that I've somehow, after all the sort of ways of being careful, I've somehow managed to get a cold, and I figured that it probably would be best to not make anyone feel uncomfortable standing around you. So I'm staying at home, but I've been following, and I hope that this will work. And second is that if there are any technology problems from my side, please just hold on, and I will come back to you. Um, and so once again, it's a real pleasure, and I'm really sorry that I haven't been able to connect with some of you in coffee and during meals, because I think that there was so much yesterday that I was really excited about that I wanted to follow up with, and I hope that we will meet again and you guys will keep coming back to King's for these kinds of events. So we have this incredibly generous window of time for me to present some work on equity and justice for older people. I'm going to present to you some slides in the first part and then do more of the normative philosophy towards the end. And because we have some time, I'm going to go through the slides fairly quickly, but not too quickly. And the real issue is not the empirical facts per se, but it's actually trying to get through the basic facts so that all of us are on the same page with some kind of social facts, and then we can move on to more of the kind of normative philosophical reasoning. And this is partly the way that I am doing my philosophy at the moment, is that rather than working in ideal theory or very high abstract level, I am trying to make sure that I'm engaged across disciplines, but also with some very sort of compelling social facts in different areas. So I think I have to say that I think the situation of older people in the world is one of the most horrific injustices that I have ever seen. And it is partly because of the enormous lack of appreciation of the lived realities of older people around the world, but also even in rich countries. And it is subsumed by enormous amounts of social biases against older people, but also this idea of conception of nature as somehow old age being a period of deterioration and social sort of withdrawal, which allows for various kinds of neglect and sort of very discriminatory and harmful policies. And I thought that before the pandemic, and during and now, I can't but be sort of even more emphatic about raising the alarm as
Sridhar, I think your audio cut. We can't hear you anymore.
you can't. Can you hear me now?
Yes, yeah, that's better.
Sorry, as you can see, whenever I have an important talk to give, my computer decides that it wants to restart. So I'm just sort of telling it not to do that, and give me 1 second while, yeah. Apologies for that. So this is basically a sign that this is a really important talk, because my computer only freaks out when I have really important talks. So let me start with the first slide. Is it okay? Can you give me a sign that everything's okay and I should proceed?
Yeah.
Okay, so let's go back a few years. And so this slide is a very famous slide that came out about 10 years ago, and it was put in a report called America Inc. And it was written by Mary Meeker, who was one of the stars of the internet period of, an internet analyst at, I think, Morgan Stanley, et cetera. And during that period of time, she became incredibly famous for her in-depth analysis of various kinds of economic and social phenomena. And so she put down sort of a book about 100 pages or 400 pages. In one of them, which really caught a lot of people's attention, was this particular slide that pictured in a very compelling way the amount of money that is spent on healthcare, but particularly it shows that the US spends a significant amount of money on people of older ages. And this is not small amounts of money. What we find is that this is in trillions of dollars. The USA by far is the one country in the world that spends the most on healthcare, and it spends about $3 trillion a year on healthcare. And this slide shows that there is very little relationship in the United States between healthcare spending and life expectancy. So combining with those two sort of ideas that most of the money in the USA healthcare is spent at later points in life, and also that there's actually no relationship between the idea that spending healthcare funds later in life does anything for life expectancy, combined with this slide. You're moving towards me. Is something wrong?
So somebody in the chat was asking if we could actually use the presenter mode after all, because the slides are slowing quite small for them.
Okay, let me move to that.
Thank
Is
you.
that better? Did that do anything?
Can the person, was it Glenn, is that better? Yeah, that's perfect. Thank you.
Okay. So this spending, as you can see, is a further kind of sort of visualization of the fact that the USA spends more money than all OECD countries combined in healthcare. So what also sort of compelled people to really take a look at the spending of healthcare is the idea that while this graph may show that we are spending money on healthcare in the later decades of life, it actually turns out that you spend money, the most money per in the last year of your life, right? So this isn't essentially the graph of increasing healthcare per year as you get older, but rather this is people dying at different ages and how much healthcare is spent in that year or last year of death. So this alarmed a great number of people and produced a kind of worry because essentially the American population, because of the baby boomers are getting older, is about to enter these later stages in life, and therefore it will overwhelm the health economic and health financing system, as well as the hospitals. And this is sort of untenable. And so people were greatly motivated to thinking about how can we reassess the spending of money on older people in the later parts of their lives, especially the last year of life. And so a great amount of sort of work has gone into rationing healthcare in older ages, but also trying to identify where and what the reasons are for different kinds of decisions about why you spend so much healthcare later in life. So this is not just a problem for the United States, it's also a problem that was identified in the United Kingdom. So what we have is a graph here that shows the similar kind of idea of healthcare spending in pounds in the UK NHS system, and you see a similar kind of sort of rise in spending. And then, but we also have the benefit of showing the breakdown of what that spending is. But what's interesting here is that I put a quote on the right-hand side, which is that, on the one hand, we may worry that you are spending too much money later in life in healthcare, but actually think about it, is that more older people are also sources of revenue, right? So you get their taxes, and especially if they're baby boomers and they're wealthy, you're going to get various kinds of direct and indirect taxes. So you actually need them at all. So what we really need to do is basically think about the costs and benefits of having older people around and how much money you spend on their healthcare versus how much money that they provide back into society. So what this sort of results in is that this must be a distributive justice problem, that this is about social resources and how we ought to distribute social resources between generations. So this must be about, sort of rational decision making in healthcare, but also thinking about just distribution across age cohorts, so older cohorts versus younger cohorts. And this compelled a very famous essay where a health economist came up with this idea of fair innings. And so some of you might be cricket players, others may not be, but the idea is that the life is like a game in which you get an opportunity to play, and therefore older people have had their opportunity to play, and we really should be more sort of emphatic about social resources going to younger people, as older people have already had their chance to play. So this is what is the standard kind of dominant analysis of what we ought to do regarding older people and the social resources that they may require. And this is also very familiar to some of you and many of you who are familiar with distributive justice theories, where we start to take what we have been thinking about in terms of distributed justice more generally, and then start to apply it to this one particular case, which is older people or group. And we apply different kinds of theories, whether it be sort of luck egalitarianism or Rawlsian, or we think about other kinds of dominant prevailing frameworks. I think that this is completely off the mark. And it also shows, for me personally, once again, how the dominant sort of thinking in the United States and the way that it sort of deals with various issues has come to dominate how we think about social and distributed justice in general, and how we start to apply it in other countries, irrespective of what the other issues might be. So what I want to focus on is something else that has also been happening while these conversations in health economics about fair innings and rationing of healthcare and how to contain the costs in older ages, is that one is in the field of geriatrics and gerontology, there has been a growing both conceptual but also political movement to redefine what old age is about. So there have been various kinds of models put forth. The idea is basically to re-examine and dismantle the idea that old age is a period of degeneration, of falling apart, of social withdrawal, and so forth. And this is because gerontologists and geriatricians saw that this was not necessarily the case for the large majority of older people, or it doesn't necessarily have to be the case for all older people, that there is in fact great quality of life for many older people, and that in fact most older people should be able to access that. There's also a second motivation for re-examining old age as a period of degeneration, which is that a large number of baby boomers in the United States, for example, don't see themselves as they get older as being sort of weaker and falling apart. They actually want to extend their period of activity and flourishing well beyond what is considered to be retirement age. And they are looking for and thinking of themselves as quite robust and active individuals. And so there's pressure from the people who are actually going into older ages to redefine themselves as being active agents later in life. So we have different models that have come about. So aside from being sort of older ages, people have sort of said, well, we should redefine aging as something called successful aging and define what that might be. Or there's been other models such as active aging, and then there's something called healthy aging. So I have been working with some colleagues in Germany who have some philosophers at the University of Tübingen who are interested in ideas about old age and older aging. And this slide is taken from one of their presentations, and it shows that there's been a number of different kinds of events over the last few decades in which a global agenda has been created in order to transform the way that we think about older people and how we conceptualize their quality of life later on. And you'll see that starting in the 1980s, which also should sort of bring back memories for some of you who are my age or older, which is that a significant period of the 1980s and particularly the 1990s was about the rise of human rights and how the language of human rights was used in a variety of different social movements in order to claim various kinds of both goods and commodities and actions from different kinds of governments as well as global organizations. So you see, particularly in the communities working with older people, that more and more what they were doing was that moving towards a new international covenant on rights of older people. And that has been going on for a number of years. And it's still going on, which is this idea of whether we should have a distinct document such as the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, but also more and more we see specific documents that are geared towards certain groups of people, like rights of disabled, rights of children, rights of women. And so there should be a right of older people as well. And so as part of that and reflecting all of that, in 2015, the World Health Organization wrote what it considers to be a landmark report called the 2015 World Report on Aging and Health. And in that report, it sort of put forward a new conception of what healthy aging should be, or how they're going to how they have are going to now from 2015 onwards work with a new conception of healthy aging. And this is going to be sort of something that permeates all the other kinds of international documents and international agenda. And so the definition of healthy aging is made possible through a combination of drawing on the social model of disability. And I don't know if some of you are familiar with disability studies and what's been going on, but the idea in the disability movement is that we should rethink the idea of disability away from thinking about individuals as being somehow deficient and impaired, but focus on the idea that an environment makes people disabled through various kinds of constraints and neglect. So the social model of disability argues that an environment makes people disabled, and what we should try to do is ensure that people who are biologically, physiologically, or mentally impaired are made able through a sort of supportive social environment. So what the group that was working on this report at the WHO did is that they took that social model of disability conception, plus it drew on some social justice philosophy, which if many of you who might have been reading or familiar with the social justice theories, is that we have a number of candidate theories of social justice in liberal tradition, whether it be the Rawlsian, utilitarian, welfarist, and also the capabilities approach, etc. So it combined the social justice theory of the capabilities approach with the social model to sort of define healthy aging, and it has two components to it. So what it did is that it first said what is on or within the body of an individual is called intrinsic capacity, and then the environments is sort of surrounding from the local to the global. And when you combine intrinsic capacity and their surrounding environments, you get this sort of idea of healthy functioning, as they call it. And what we should be thinking about is healthy aging consists of people having sufficient healthy functioning to be able to pursue, be and do what they are able to do. So this all surprisingly this slide is basically trying to bring those two things together. So this idea of functional ability that combines the intrinsic capacity with the environments. And so the idea is that healthy aging is a conception that assesses people's functional abilities, and we should ensure that people have sort of a basic threshold of these functional abilities. So far, so good. I'm sorry if I'm droning. Just raise your hand to say, okay, everything's okay. Great, thank you. So, so this remarkable sort of conception of healthy aging, in which it moves away from this idea of deficiency, degeneration, social withdrawal, and maintenance of sort of declining facilities, to one where we think about the important role of the social environment, and sort of thinking about it in terms of the significant role that social environments play, and sort of trying to ensure that every older person has this claim, comes from some Indian philosopher guy based in London who wrote a book called Health Justice, where he argued that the health capability is something that we should be focusing on, and sort of the idea of a right to health is actually best understood as a right to health capability. And this capability is a combination of internal factors and external conditions. And what we should be doing is ensuring that people have sort of a basic set of capabilities that sort of lead to a minimally decent life. So what happened is that as a result of that surprising use of this conception in the World Health Report, I had a chance to go to the World Health Organization and spend a year and a half to help them figure out how to flesh out the both the ethical implications of that kind of use of that argument. But also it was an opportunity for me to really understand and learn the kind of social epidemiology and facts about older people and older aging. And I want to share some of that with you, because I think it was surprising to me, and I think it'll be surprising to you, or some of you at least. The first thing that's happening in the world is that the entire human species as it stands now is getting older as a whole. So there is currently what people call population aging around the world. And what that is trying to show is that there are going to be a larger number of older people in the world than ever before. And so, for example, in this picture, what we see is that in 2015, 30% of people are older than 60 years old. And most of those people, as you will see here using my cursor, is actually in Japan, etc. But 2050, what's going to happen is that a larger number of countries and in the world are going to be older than 60, and most of that you'll see is in Europe and also in China and some other countries. The second thing that is happening, which is that the amount of time it's taking for populations of various countries to age is happening, the amount of time is much, much faster or sort of quicker than it was for other countries that are getting there right now. So what I mean by that is that if you look at France on the left, it took over 100 years for its population to change such that over 30% is older. And while in India, it's going to take just simply 30 years. So that rapid social demographic transformation from being a young population to an old population is happening much faster. And the idea is that many of these countries are just simply not prepared for an aging population. Their social institutions, their basic social organizations, policies, legislation, etc., is just not ready and not capable of taking on this significant amount of social demographic change. What is important, as you saw in the beginning of these slides, is that I focused very much on the United States and their worry about their healthcare spending. But what we see is actually in the future, and currently and in the future, the greatest proportion of older people will be living in resource poor settings, so low and middle income countries. While the rich countries will also be having older people, it's actually the poorer countries who are going to have much older people. And as you can see, and emphasizing what I just said before, is that developing countries, particularly low resource poor settings, do not simply have the resources, institutions, or sort of an approach ready for all of that is happening and will happen. This is a bit more sort of global disaggregated data about what's going to happen in the coming sort of few years, where you will see that a significant amount of populations around the world will have not only older people above the age of 60, but in places like China and other places, there's going to be significant number of older people that are over the age of 80 and 90. So it's not just they're 65, it's actually there's going to be a lot more people who are 85, 95, sort of around. This also means from a health perspective that the disease prevalence of various kinds of impairments that impact older people will also be increasing. So the idea of dementia as being something that is a significant worry and issue for older people will, the number of older people experiencing dementia and affecting family relationships, resources, etc., will also increase. And what we find is that extraordinarily difficult period of life will affect people in low and middle income countries more, because there will be more of them. And as you can imagine, and sort of saying, even though I'm being redundant, is that these societies are simply not ready, and they do not have the capacity to deal with human beings experiencing those kinds of difficult impairments. Beyond this worry about disease and this idea that both rich and poor countries are simply not ready for the healthcare needs, what we also have is that old people are significantly not only socially excluded, but they face a huge number of experiences that we would find apparent if we sort of thought of them as happening to people who are in middle ages or younger, in terms of them being socially excluded physically from social interactions, the amount of discrimination that they face. So not only arbitrary discrimination from such as exclusion from employment arbitrarily because of some age, but also if you sort of there's a litany of ways in which older people are discriminated against from social interactions, social advantages, social processes, etc. And then beyond that, what we have is that we see that there's a huge amount of intersection between older age and various other kinds of social disadvantage. So whether it be indigenous identity, race, sex, sexuality, class, etc. So the worry about the main problem of older age being about healthcare spending is minor and is a distraction from this much broader social exclusion and disadvantage and oppression and domination of older people that is very little sort of recognized in the world. Now, what is extraordinary is that amidst that background situation in which we in the WHO, in international sort of organizations and other people who are working with older age, were attempting to rally a conceptual understanding of older age, but also tabulate the different kinds of problems that older people around the world are suffering and try to mobilize a response. As we started with that, when we were about to, so 2020 was supposed to be, or is the start of the decade of healthy aging, as the United Nations call it. So it's supposed to be 10 years of global response, coordinated response and stuff. The pandemic happened. And what we saw and what we're still seeing is that this pandemic is an absolute kind of decimation of older people in every society in the world. And so what we see, so this slide is from 2000, so this is from the United States. And what you see is that the people that have died are largely older people. And this is not only because of biological vulnerability, but this, as we can see, and hopefully you all will be able to see, comes from various kinds of neglect that all of us have faced and that has increased our vulnerability in general, but also very specific kinds of social policies that actually discriminated against older people. So for example, a number of policies were created during the pandemic such that if an older person had COVID, then rather than being sent to the hospital, they were essentially given palliative care. And so they died in the nursing homes and poor conditions in nursing homes. Or that in the UK, emergency ambulance drivers were told to increase the threshold if people had different kinds of emergencies, so that they actually are not brought into the hospital and they're actually left at home after giving minor treatment. And there's lots of other reasons as well. But what we see is that overall, by far, this pandemic has killed older people. As of yesterday or this week, there is an argument, or there's some sort of tabulation that we have reached the 5 million death mark around the world. But what people have not been saying very much is that probably about 3 to 4 million of that 5 are older people over the age of 50. But what is even more astounding is that The Economist has been coming out with estimates, which they say has sort of somehow 90% confidence interval, that the number of excess mortality as a result of this pandemic is probably closer to 19 million around the world. And that significant number of 19 million is older people. What we also know, if you've been sort of looking at the disaggregated data, it's that this these older people are not every older people, or it's not just on average older people, is that these older people also tend to be racially, what do you call racialized groups or minorities in populations. So there is sort of both an overlay of age here, but also different kinds of social disadvantage. So what we see here is that almost in every country and around the world, and now in many low and middle income countries, is that older people are dying, and of the older people, it's the actual socially disadvantaged people are the ones that have been dying. And so far, we are up to about 20 million or 19, 20 million. And as you know, as we all know, is that this is going to go on for a few more years, because the vaccines that can save people from dying are not being sort of distributed to low and middle income countries. And if the number that are getting there aren't going to older people, they're actually going to the well-off people, people who can push themselves to the front of the line. And so the idea that there's somehow growing equity in the world because of vaccine distribution is actually sort of not true, because it's actually not getting to older people, particularly older people that are most likely to die because of various kinds of biological and social disadvantage. So let me then go back to this idea that healthy aging should be thought about not only in terms of biological, internal or intrinsic biological capacity, but we should be thinking about healthy aging as a combination of both intrinsic capacity and external social environments. And this is particularly important because, as you can see from our experience with the pandemic, is that it's not just our intrinsic capacity to be sort of strong against infection. There's a great amount of social conditions that allowed us to protect ourselves from infection before the vaccine, in terms of all the different kinds of social support mechanisms, et cetera. But also with the vaccine, then that's an additional social intervention that's allowed us to maintain our functioning and keep going. So I put a little funny little red star and yellow thing as a sign for myself, but also for you, is that in my presentation, I wanted to focus on these particular points, because this is where the philosophy, which some of you might be interested in or disagree with, is actually what I'm focused on as a result of all these different kinds of social facts that I'm presenting it. So one big thing in all of this is this idea of health as being a combination of intrinsic factors, but also external conditions and a health capability, and how healthy aging is being reconceptualized as that. So if we sort of pin that as being one of the fundamental philosophical aspects of it, I want to now move on to what I was working on before, which I think has just been more supported by what's been happening over the last 2 years. So one of the fundamental facts about what I'm going to try to argue is this idea of health inequalities in a society, but that health is distributed along a social gradient. So I don't know if all of you know, or some of you will probably know this very well, but just so that we get a very quick sort of understanding of it, is that this is a picture from the United Kingdom. And basically, we think about health as being somehow distributed between the haves and the have-nots. And that is not the case. What it is that if we take life expectancy, what we find is that this is a social hierarchy. This is socioeconomic class that the UK uses in sort of census data. And what we find is that every socioeconomic class lives longer and is healthier than the one below it. So this is not just true of the UK. What we find is that this social gradient exists in every industrialized country. But also more recently, over the last 10, 12 years, what we found is that there is a social gradient in poor countries as well. So we think about poor countries as being really poor, and therefore it's a haves and have-nots question, something about the elites and the masses. But actually, if you look, what we find is that there's actually a social gradient in poor countries as well. Every socioeconomic class lives longer and is healthier than the one below it. This is under 5 mortality. So it's not just life expectancy that we can see this in, but we can also see this in every single health issue, including under 5 mortality. So throughout the world, there is a fundamental social fact, which is that health and life expectancy is distributed across a social gradient. It mirrors the socioeconomic hierarchy in every society. So this is important as you think about is that because instead of thinking about one individual going through a life course in a society, what we need to start thinking about is this social gradient of a population moving across time and people essentially falling down as they go through time. And so the people at the top will obviously live longer and be healthier than the one below it and the bottom. And this is really important because when you look at something like a life expectancy, it erases, it obfuscates these inequalities within a population. And it only just talks about generic averages. And as you know, if the top is doing really well and the bottom is doing not so well, the average will put you somewhere in between and you think everything's fine. But you can have a really great top and a really low performing bottom and you still end up in the middle and you think everything's fine. But that may not be the case. So the gradient is really important when we think about health inequalities. The second thing that is really important aside from the social gradient is that we now have overwhelming evidence, though not pervasively understood or acknowledged, particularly in the United States, that healthcare is a minor determinant of health and disease, that actually it's an entire over the life course, you have significant influence of the social environment affecting your experience of health and disease. It starts from the moment that you are conceived, where how your mother experienced her pregnancy, whether she had sufficient nutrition, but also her stress levels and various kinds of environmental factors will influence in utero your not only the quality of your birth, but actually your health profile over life and how long you will live. So your pre-birth conditions impact how your older age will be like. But beyond that, your first 2 years have significant influence, not only in those 2 years and not only in your adolescence and teenage years, but also something that happens early on may come back and affect you later on in life. So this is where social justice philosophy comes in and where my work has focused on is this idea that health is not just about the distribution of healthcare, but rather that it's about paying attention to all the different kinds of social conditions and basic social institutions that impact health and disease, and that we should be really thinking about this capability, which puts the idea of individual biological functioning plus the external environment together and making sure that they are sort of capable of living their life to the extent that they can and the way that they want to live. So why this is important is that this should impact our considerations of what claims individuals have later in life. So when in that early slide, we were spending a lot of money up here later in life, and we thought that this was a great problem because we're spending so much money here, and that in fact it's unfair to all those people early on. What I would argue is that when you put the social determinants framework into this picture, we have a much more complicated and compelling set of considerations. So one of them is that if two individuals have reached the age of 60 per se, And you say, well, now that you've reached the age of 60, you've had your fair innings at life, and therefore we think that you're now on your own in regarding how you want to spend your money regarding healthcare, because we think we've done enough and we're going to spend the money on somebody else. This is profoundly unfair to, say, a woman who has a really bad life and she's managed to get to 60. And then you tell her essentially, because you've gotten to 60, we're not going to help you anymore. This may seem far-fetched in a rich country, but this is actually what most of the situation in low and resource poor settings is about, is that essentially many girls and women have a very difficult life for lots of various kinds of reasons. And then once they get to 60, you say, well, you got to 60, and therefore, actually, we think that it would be much more fair if we spent the social resources on younger people rather than you. When actually, what I think we should be thinking about is that there is this potential idea of compensatory justice, is that when you've harmed individuals over the life course, when you've constrained their well-being and their opportunities for life, that actually during a period in which they are most vulnerable and they are no longer obligated perhaps to sort of contribute to the same social roles as you can, rather than seeing them as weights on the rest of society, it's an opportunity that you try to correct for and compensate as much as you can. So that would be one argument that I would like to make regarding how you should think about older people and distributive justice, is that you take a life course perspective and think about the determinants, not just in a causal story, but in a moral responsibility story, and say, what does society, who's created all these conditions on the left, owe the people who are at the end? So the second thing that I want to show is that this is a graph that is reflecting what inequalities within older people look like. So what we see here is there is a measure called hand grip strength, where you can use hand grip strength as a proxy for how strong and vital an individual is. And so it's often used on older people to see kind of where they are regarding the sort of vitality, right? And what we see here is that these are different layers of age groups. So when you actually start to disaggregate the data between 60 and 90 plus by 5-year increments, what you see is a great variation. Not only is it a picture of, say, a decline of variation or a decline per 5 years, what I want you to focus on is the fact of the spread within the 5-year age group. So what this means is that one person who is much older could be much, much healthier than someone who is decades younger than them. So there is great diversity within groups of older people. And this is also true in terms of life expectancy and health and all these other ways. So there's a great amount of inequality among older people. And what we also should recognize is that a significant number of people never got to this age. So lots of people have unjustly been constrained from reaching old age because of various kinds of social conditions. So that's one kind of social injustice. But also, what we see here is that there is great amount of inequalities. And so we need to think about what the sources of those inequalities are. So this leads me to a second sort of normative point. If you look at a group of older people with their great inequalities and diversity here, then what you see here is that, say, someone who's doing really well in old age, perhaps, Elsa, are you telling me to shut up?
I didn't know that my vision on the screen would be so imposing, or indeed that you could see me at all. It's just that you should mind the time, because you have been speaking
Okay.
for 50 minutes.
Oh, I'm so sorry. It's so exciting. I love this stuff, as you can see. So what I'm going to do is wrap this up in 1 minute, and then I want people to tell me what they think. Okay, sorry.
Perfect.
Okay, so just quickly then, I will make the quick 2 points. So there is a normative point here to be made, that the people who are older, who are doing well in the older ages as compared to their colleagues, have gotten that way because of what the other colleagues have contributed to their well-being. So what I mean by this is that Bill Gates is doing really well, not only because of the social conditions over his life course, but also by the fact that the people that are in his sort of same cohort, but in lower socioeconomic groups, have contributed to his well-being. So to give you a concrete example, think about the fact that we survived, many of us have survived our social sort of lockdowns by the fact that other people were working in the sort of public facilities and providing us food in order for us to be able to do it. So there is very much an interdependency within age cohorts. And so the question is, what does Bill Gates owe his colleagues in lower socioeconomic gradients as a result of that? And then the third normative point is that this entire group, if this was a group in the United States or the UK, has allowed or has been enabled to reach older age because of their society's place in the world and how they've been interdependent and perhaps extracting resources and other kinds of labor from other societies. So not only that, what does Bill Gates owe his sort of colleagues in his lower socioeconomic class, but what does Bill Gates owe all the other older people in the world that have contributed to the social conditions that have enabled that cohort to proceed? So those were three distinct points. There's many, many more points. As you can see, this is sort of huge area that's ripe for examination. But the 3 points that I've made to you is, one, this idea of health capability. Two is the idea that social justice demands the consideration of life course, not just sort of distribution of healthcare in one place. Three, I've started to focus on inequalities within older people and us thinking about the relationships between sort of higher well-being older people within their own age groups, but also thinking about global equity and justice, and also understanding that older people in rich societies are having great well-being, not just because of what happened within their country, but what their country has done to other countries in order to get to that point. Okay, thank you very much. I hope that was interesting, and I look forward to questions and comments and anything else that you have to say. Thank you.